CNN's Elena Treen is in Pittsburgh, where President Trump is also set to speak here in a few minutes. Elena, what more are you learning about how the White House is handling the fallout here?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very clear from our reporting, our conversations with White House officials, Trump administration officials, that he wants specifically this story, or people to move on from this story. He's trying to get his base to let this go away, and he's directing some of his team behind closed doors to do what they can to help it die down. That's why we actually saw the president directly making calls this weekend. We know he reached out to Charlie Kirk, a fierce supporter of his, the head of the Turning Point USA, and they held a summit this weekend. He had tried to, convince him to, knock off with the criticism, tamp down some of the criticism of the handling of this Epstein case. And we actually saw Kirk yesterday say that for now, he is not going to comment further on all of this. And we also know that the vice president, J.D. Vance, he was trying to play peacemaker with people within the administration where there's been infighting on this between the FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino. He also called Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, and Attorney General Pam Bondi were reporting. But just to add to some of what we heard from the president right there, he's been very full-throated in his defense of Bondi repeatedly now in the last several days. But he also argued that, he believes that if she believes that they can put out some more of these files and have them do it in a credible way, that she should. But then he also tried to argue and really cast the blame on some of his political opponents, saying they made up some of this idea that there was a file list or a client list in the first place. Take a listen.
On Epstein, of the review of the files, Attorney General Pam Bondi.
A very quick briefing.
Did she tell you, what did she tell you about the review? And specifically, did she tell you at all that your name appeared in the file?
No, she's given us just a very quick briefing, and in terms of the credibility of the different things that they've seen. And I would say that, these files were made up by Comey, they were made up by Obama, they were made up by the Biden, we went through years of that with the Russia hoax, with all of the different things that we had to go through. We've gone through years of it, but she's handled it very well, and it's going to be up to her. Whatever she thinks is credible, she should release.
So a few things to note there, and of course I want to really point out that when he references former Presidents Obama and Biden, or former FBI Director James Comey saying that they made up the Epstein files, I'd remind you that a lot of people in the president's base, and even some people in the administration, had been the ones who had really been pushing this idea that these Epstein files needed to be released, that there was more to them, that there was potential accomplices listed in them. So I just want to give you that quick fact check. But look, all to say, I think the big point on this is a story now that has been out for over a week, and the backlash we have seen from his base, from the MAGA wing of his party, has not really quieted down despite the president's efforts to get them to move on from this. And so that's why he's continuing to really have to come out here and defend the Attorney General, but it doesn't look like he's changing his tune on that just yet, Brianna.
Yeah, it does not. Elena Treen, thank you for that report. Let's go now to CNN Chief Data Analyst Harry Enten. And Harry Enten, there's a new CNN poll that's just out. How's the controversy impacting the president's support?
Yeah, I would say that the word is dissatisfied. That is how Americans feel in terms of the releases so far of the Epstein case. Take a look here. Epstein case, amount of info release. The winner here, 50% dissatisfied. Doesn't matter, 29%, not heard enough, 17%. But look at the bottom of your screen. The percentage that are satisfied is just 3%. That's 1, that's 2, that is just 3%. I feel like the count on Sesame Street. Just 3% of Americans are satisfied so far with the amount of information released. The clear winner in this particular case is 50%. Half of the public is dissatisfied, at least so far.
And are you seeing a big difference between how Republicans and Democrats are viewing this?
No, and that I think is kind of the interesting sort of nugget in what's going on here. You see this 50% dissatisfied, and let's break it down by party. Okay, Epstein case, amount of info released. Look at this. You get 43% of lean GOP, that's Republicans and independents who lean towards the Republican Party, who are dissatisfied. Look at this. Just 4% satisfied? My goodness gracious. When you only have 4% that is with Donald Trump on a particular issue, that is ridiculously low. I've never seen anything quite like it. How about lean Democrat? 60% dissatisfied. Compare that to 3% who are satisfied. Again, 4%, 3%, Republican, Democrat, you rarely ever see this type of agreement. Now, of course, there's another divide in American politics, one that has increased over the past few decades, and that is whites with a college degree, whites without a college degree. But in this particular case, we see agreement. What are we talking about? This Epstein case, amount of info released, dissatisfied? 55% of white college graduates and 53% of white non-college graduates, Donald Trump's historic base, yet the majority are dissatisfied.
Really interesting numbers. Harry Enten, thank you so much. Boris?
Let's dig deeper on this with former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. Andy, thanks so much for being with us. I want to start with what you make of this rift between the current Deputy Director and the DOJ, and then by extension, the White House.
Sure, Boris. So the tension between the Deputy Director and the AG is really untenable. This is a bad thing for the FBI, bad thing for the Department of Justice, and really not the kind of thing that, in my experience, having worked for many attorneys general, never seen anything like this before. And I can't imagine any other attorney general ever tolerating an act of disrespect along the lines of what allegedly took place between Pam Bondi and Dan Bongino in the White House when they got into some trading accusations and some sort of shouting match in front of the president's chief of staff. I can't imagine that happening. DOJ and FBI frequently knock heads on issues and have different opinions about the way to handle investigations, but those conversations always take place in the house, within the family. You never let those things spill over into the public. It's important for the leadership, for the workforce in both organizations, that they see the leadership together as one team in which the Attorney General makes the final call on everything, period, no exceptions.
I wonder whether you think it's likely that Bongino continues in this role, because even though we just heard less than an hour ago President Trump say that he likes Dan Bongino, he has been much more effusive in his support for Attorney General Bondi. It doesn't seem like she's going anywhere.
And, Boris, that makes total sense, right? It's very hard to replace an attorney general. I mean, he had a hard time getting Pam Bondi, obviously, with the problems the administration had initially selecting Matt Gaetz. You don't have any of those sorts of issues replacing a deputy director, as I myself learned. A deputy director can be reassigned, can be removed. Dan Bongino, I would expect, could be convinced to resign if he's leaning that way. He said several negative things about his experience so far, said that he doesn't like the job, that sort of stuff. So I find it almost hard to believe that Dan will be able to continue in that role with all of the drama that they've put forth in the last week, on top of his already fairly negative reviews about the role. He's a guy that is going to have a hard time getting the confidence of the workforce because he's not an FBI agent. He doesn't come from the organization, and this certainly has not made that any easier for him.
Just a moment ago, you were being self-deprecating, saying that it was easy to find a replacement as Deputy FBI Director, but there was something that President Trump said this afternoon that I found interesting, and I wanted to get your thoughts on, because he suggested that in a White House briefing in which he was presented evidence regarding the Epstein files, he found whatever was in the briefing to not be credible, and he charged that James Comey, among others, had something to do with that information not being credible, insinuating perhaps that it was tampered with, that they made up these files. You took over as acting FBI director when Trump fired Comey back in May of 2017. It wasn't until summer of 2019 that Jeffrey Epstein was even arrested. So I wonder if at any point while you were serving in the Bureau, whether as deputy or as acting director, you came across any information at all related to Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, short answer, Boris, is none. Not in any way. And when you understand the timeline, it makes perfect sense, right? Epstein's initial investigation by local authorities and the FBI in Southern Florida ended with an indictment in 2008, I believe, if I have that year correct. And that was the indictment that was mysteriously, essentially given away by then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta, who then later served in Trump's first term as his Secretary of Labor. So Mr. Acosta basically washed the case away with what we call a non-prosecution agreement, in which Epstein was able to plead guilty to 2 very minor local offenses and serve a pretty relaxed form of incarceration for 18 months. There was no activity, investigative activity, on Epstein until 2019, as you indicated, when the Southern District of New York opened the investigation that ultimately landed him in jail and where he killed himself. So Jim Comey was not in the FBI when the early investigation was tanked by Alex Acosta, or the later one was started by Jeffrey Berman, who was the attorney, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District at the time. So that allegation is absolutely preposterous. That's standard Donald Trump, whenever he's in trouble, to start to throw rocks at Jim Comey, Barack Obama, myself, our former colleagues. We just expect that now and disregard it anytime we hear it.
Andrew McCabe, always appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Boris.